Berlin in 1948 carried a fragile quiet that felt temporary. Trams rang through streets still lined with blasted walls. Market stalls reopened with careful hands and cautious glances. In apartments heated by scavenged fuel, families counted ration coupons and time. At the edges of that routine, a slower contest took shape. Checkpoints multiplied. Freight wagons waited on sidings without explanation. A city that lived on connections began to feel them loosen. The story you are about to hear is a dramatized reconstruction that may blend documented facts with reasoned inference. It draws from public sources such as press bulletins, municipal notices, and recorded statements that were accessible at the time. Where the record is silent, events are suggested in ways that fit the known conditions and the behavior of officials as described by witnesses. There are no hidden technologies here and no secret powers. Only paperwork, timetables, and orders that traveled through offices and guard posts. This narrative aims to present how the early weeks might have sounded and felt. It avoids conclusions and leaves room for alternative readings. The tone remains calm and investigative. The timeline stays inside the late 1940s and follows the sequence as it likely unfolded. Dates and places appear when they help anchor the scene. What follows begins with ordinary mornings that grew uncertain, then widens toward a blockade that seemed to start without a single, loud declaration. The purpose is to understand how systems were slowed, how messages were delivered, and how choices narrowed. The city did not fall silent. It learned to listen for delays and for signs that a corridor might close by nightfall. From those signals, Berliners started to guess at the next day, and at the quiet test that was being set for them. The first signs appeared like routine friction, and many residents treated them that way. A milk truck missed a turn because a crossing was closed without notice. A tram conductor stepped down at an unfamiliar halt and told passengers to continue on foot. In one sector office, an administrator posted a circular that used careful language about safety checks on rail lines. On the river, barge pilots heard that inspections would take longer than usual and that paperwork must be resubmitted. None of these moments announced a wider plan. They felt like local adjustments to a system still recovering from war. The effect multiplied when these adjustments repeated over days. Small warehouses filled with goods that could not be forwarded. A coal yard reported a backlog and asked shopkeepers to be patient. A press bulletin mentioned coordination issues and urged calm. That language was firm yet non-specific, and it left room for any interpretation. Berliners adjusted their routines while keeping an ear on rumor. A teacher told her class to bring extra bread because the canteen might close early. A clerk returned to a siding 3 times in 1 week and found the wagon sealed each time. The pattern suggested a hand tightening, then waiting, then tightening again. This was not a barricade built overnight. It rose out of offices, counters, and stamps that lingered in drawers until they were needed. At intersection points, the presence of uniformed guards began to feel heavier. They asked for papers that had never been questioned, then asked for new papers that few had seen. Travelers started carrying more documents than before and expected to be told they had brought the wrong ones. Public statements framed these checks as routine oversight. The repetition pointed to intent even when the words avoided it. Western officials compared notes in sector meetings and tried to diagnose the cause of each delay. They spoke in cautious terms because any misreading could escalate the situation. Some reports suggested that traffic would normalize if schedules were adjusted. Others quietly predicted that the interruptions would widen. The more cautious voices advised restraint and warned against symbolic moves at checkpoints. Berliners listened for train whistles at night and noticed when they stopped. You could count the change by the silence between departures. The city adapted by shrinking expectations. A shop would open without guarantee of stock. A service would operate until it could not. Each day felt like an exam for which the questions arrived late. The record leaves room for debate about whether a written order set this in motion or whether several orders drifted toward the same result. What is clear is that movement became permission-based. That permission could be granted or withheld with a single stamp. When residents looked at maps, the lines that mattered were not drawn on paper. They were lines at crossings, on bridges, and at the mouths of tunnels where a man with a pad could pause traffic until dusk. The western position inside the city remained legal and fixed, but the lifelines that fed it were not. Those routes ran through stations, depots, and locks that required cooperation. When cooperation thinned, each crossing took on political weight. The tone in meetings shifted to careful phrases like temporary disruption and necessary review. Those phrases did not restore a wagon that had missed its slot. They did signal that the discussion had widened beyond local offices. Berliners noted that change as well, then returned to cues that now formed earlier and ended sooner. Reports from station logs began to tell the same story across multiple sites. Timetables were posted and then ignored. Yard managers counted a steady rise in loaded cars with nowhere to go. One or two would be allowed to pass, and that exception would be used as proof that nothing had changed. Then the next line would be held again. By late June, mornings felt brittle. The light was soft and kind at dawn, but it revealed thinner shelves. The western garrisons measured rations against an unknown horizon. In quiet offices, planners reviewed options that did not depend on friendly rails or rivers. Before any decision formed, people in the city reached for radios at set hours and waited for official messages that might add or subtract a corridor by sunset. As the last freight wagons turned back from the boundary, attention shifted toward what might still move without passing through a road or a lock, and toward which fields inside the city could handle continuous landings if the ground routes never reopened. The day the ground routes effectively closed did not begin with sirens. It began with refusals that sounded procedural rather than dramatic. At key points, the answer was the same. A train could not proceed because documentation had changed overnight. A barge must wait because a new inspection was required. Trucks were told to return to their depots and seek clarification from offices that did not answer phones. By the evening, the pattern looked less like confusion and more like a settled posture. That posture did not claim to be a blockade, but it had the same result. It carried the weight of administrative certainty. Guards did not shout. They pointed to new rules and held their ground. Inside the city, the streets adjusted in hours. Shop counters came up short. The exchange of goods between sectors grew tentative. People with bicycles became couriers of rumor. The tone in the Western Command grew quiet and technical. Officers pulled maps and marked the routes that now carried a question mark. They looked at warehouses and counted days. Some calculations were based on records that seemed incomplete because the flow had never been cut so sharply before. A set of meeting notes from that week, preserved in outline form, recorded measured phrases about obligations and access. Those notes capture how carefully the conversation had to move. Every statement would be read for motive. Every motive could be misread as a threat. The city's utility services kept operating, though their managers began to plan for limitations. Nothing about the water running in taps made a headline, yet the stability of that flow depended on spare parts and fuel that now faced their own checks. Ration lines lengthened. A grocer wrote that deliveries would be irregular and advised customers to plan around what arrived, not what was promised. It felt like a test designed to press people into resignation. Residents responded by extending routines that had carried them through the previous winter. They knew how to make do, though they also knew that supplies could not be stretched forever. Evening radio carried official statements that tried to avoid sharp edges. Each phrase was checked against the risk of turning a standoff into a confrontation. Public patience was not an infinite resource. City leaders asked for calm while they pressed for corridors to reopen. The other side replied that no corridors were formally closed, only held for required compliance. The difference between those phrases meant little to a rail yard worker who had not moved a wagon in days. Inside offices, people studied regulations and looked for footnote paths that might allow a convoy through. A few small shipments moved under special arrangements. Their passage was used as proof that nothing had changed. Then the next request was denied. The signal was consistent despite that occasional release. You could see that in the daily notes kept by station clerks and by the logs of barges that never left their moorings. The western garrisons faced a calendar that felt tighter each night. Resupply by land did not look reachable. Airfields inside the city became points on which larger plans might pivot. Tempelhof and Gatow were not blank spaces on a map. They were active places with ground crews, lights, and people who knew how to move cargo in small units. They were also surrounded by a city that needed food and fuel every day. Any plan that used them would have to run without pause and with attention to weather and surface conditions. The idea of sustained air supply had been considered before. Now it moved from concept to necessity, because the alternative seemed to be slow surrender by shortage. The phrase test of resolve appeared in private notes and in careful public statements. Not everyone agreed that the city could be sustained by air. The estimates varied by source and by confidence, yet the pressure of time forced action while arguments continued. Within municipal offices, a simple question framed the days ahead. How do we keep the lights on and bread on counters while negotiations describe progress without delivering it? There was no single answer. There were only parallel efforts that each carried risk. Western officials spoke about maintaining presence and fulfilling responsibilities. Their tone remained measured and plain. They knew audiences were listening beyond the city. They also knew Berliners would judge words by what moved on runways before dawn. With ground routes stalled, attention centered on schedules that did not depend on a friendly checkpoint and on whether the air above the city could carry enough weight to keep normal life from breaking under the strain. Plans that once sat in folders moved onto desks. The sequence began with inventory. How much food could be issued per day without breaking the stores? How much coal should be saved for heat and for essential services? These counts formed the base of all further work. They used figures that had already been tracked by quartermasters and city officials. The next step considered capacity. Runways inside the city needed to handle frequent landings in variable conditions. Ground crews would have to unload quickly and return the surface to readiness. There was nothing exotic about this process. It was labor and timing. Minutes saved on the ground would add up across a day. Western planners gathered in sector offices with maps of approach paths and ledgers of needs. The tone stayed practical and restrained. Some records mention an internal briefing that set daily targets in cautious terms. In that outline, numbers appear without rhetoric. They read like limits rather than promises. The proposal faced doubts from many directions. Weather could ground planes at the wrong hour. Surfaces could deteriorate under constant use. Crews might tire and schedules slip. Berliners could lose patience if deliveries fell under expectations. None of these doubts were dramatic. They were ordinary risks made larger by scale. The command weighed them because the city did not have a second path. On the other side, officials stood by the position that access was a matter of compliance with procedures. That stance offered no reliable ground route and left the air as the only clear space that could be organized without a gate. Even that space would be watched and measured. Planners knew that order on the ground signaled commitment from above. They looked at Tempelhof's layout and at service roads that carried loads from the field into warehouses. They looked at Gatow and at how its location served different parts of the city. They considered the rhythm of day and night and the predictable quiet hours when residents slept. Could operations continue through those hours without undue disturbance? Could the city accept the noise in exchange for certainty? These questions touched daily life and could not be ignored. City officials drafted statements that described the plan without promising outcomes. They knew expectations must be managed. A newspaper editor prepared space for schedules and notices. A radio service planned to announce expected arrivals in simple language. Those decisions mattered because people needed signals they could trust. If the voice said bread would be available at noon, the next step was to prove that statement by noon. Early test flights brought small loads to measure turnaround time. These were not demonstrations for the sake of optics. They were real deliveries intended to refine a system. Crews recorded every delay and marked sets of tasks that could be compressed. They found shortcuts that did not violate safety or order. They set aside space for unexpected repairs and shaped lanes for trucks to reach stores without crossing paths. Over time, small gains became structural habits. The target numbers still looked high, yet they no longer felt theoretical. The work made them concrete. Meanwhile, Berliners folded this new soundscape into their days. Dawn began with a distant approach and a low churn that built and faded. Children learned to recognize patterns and to count intervals. Market hours edged forward to align with morning deliveries. At night, people slept through noise that had become familiar. In private, some officials admitted that the plan might hold only if weather cooperated. That truth never left the briefing room because it could not help morale. The city learned to accept uncertainty while operating as if the system would sustain itself. Two trustworthy indicators supported that posture. An operations log at Tempelhof tracked landings and offloads with timestamps that matched warehouse receipts. A municipal bulletin recorded daily rations delivered to districts, cross-checked by local offices. Those documents provided a baseline that residents could feel in their hands when a ration card was stamped. The plan's credibility rested on that loop from runway to counter. It still required discipline from everyone involved. Any long delay could ripple through the day and cut into evening targets. The organizers adjusted schedules to absorb those moments. They did not promise more than could be delivered. They promised to keep moving. As days settled into this pattern, the city did not grow comfortable. It grew focused. People watched weather reports more closely than editorials. A cloud layer could change the tone of an entire day. Crews worked with a patience that carried them through uncertainty. Their confidence stayed quiet and it spread. That steadiness did not solve the political themes that had triggered the crisis. It built a temporary floor under them. With that floor in place, Berliners could plan past tomorrow. They could think in weeks rather than hours. Negotiations continued in rooms that were not visible to the public. Messages passed between capitals and occupied offices. The city kept listening for signals that the ground might reopen. Until then, every runway schedule read like a public promise written in plain numbers. As the first sustained wave of flights hinted at a workable rhythm, attention turned to reinforcement of the effort, to the maintenance of fields under heavy use, and to the next round of talks that might reshape the balance at the checkpoints. By the second month, the plan behaved less like an emergency and more like a strict routine that carried its own discipline. Berlin learned the rhythm by ear. Dawn began with the steady roll of approaches toward Tempelhof and Gatow, each arrival followed by the chore of unloading, sorting, and sending goods onward to districts that had adjusted their hours around the new pulse. The work felt repetitive from the outside, but inside it changed just enough each day to demand attention. Weather seldom matched forecasts. A brief squall might force a break in arrivals, then a compressed sequence would follow to recover the schedule. Ground crews grew skilled at reading the sky above the buildings and the shine of the runway after a shower. They learned how the surface held up under a week of constant use and where to place the next stack so a truck could take a clean line out to the road. Shopkeepers read the same rhythm in smaller signs. A doorbell at noon, a crate that arrived close to closing time, forcing a quick reopen so neighbors could collect bread before evening. The city settled into queues that were shorter when the morning went well and longer when the wind changed shape over rooftops. Nothing about this felt inevitable. Each gain could be lost by a single mishap. Planners kept their language careful and operational. They avoided words that could not be met by action. Two indicators helped maintain trust without fanfare. A daily airfield board listed target and actual movements in neat columns, which a clerk copied into a simple circular shared with municipal offices. A city distribution note recorded how much of the day's consignments reached each district, with a margin for next-day adjustments. These records did not cheer anyone. They gave people something to measure, which had its own calming effect. The city was not being promised impressions. It was being promised counts that could be checked. On the other side of the boundary, the posture remained steady and firm. Officials repeated that compliance would restore normal passage, yet the terms of compliance seemed to move with each attempt to satisfy them. The statement and the reality preserved their distance. In response, the airplan thickened, slots tightened, turnarounds shortened by increments that hardly seemed worth the effort, until they accrued into a full extra delivery across a day. Workers learned to keep conversation light and hands constant. They did not rush, they did not idle. Berliners noticed crews leaving the fields on bicycles or in small lorries at strange hours faces lined with the day's grit. Those were not heroic images. They were the shape of persistence. Inside sector offices, meetings addressed the same narrow set of issues: how to maintain rate, how to distribute strain, how to keep the pattern understandable to the public. Radio announcements adjusted their phrasing to reduce confusion around timing. The city press avoided adjectives and printed straightforward notices. When runs exceeded plan, editors did not celebrate. They logged the overage as a cushion for the next day. Confidence rose in modest steps, and always with the caveat that tomorrow might ask for more. Occasional accidents did occur, as any effort of scale will allow. They were treated as technical events with minimal comment. Investigations were contained to operating rooms and resolved with changes to practice. There was no appetite for spectacle. The city's mood remained careful. People understood that tone as part of the bargain. You do not expect a dramatic speech when the message is to keep steady. Private doubts persisted and were allowed to exist without public scolding. Some officials believed that the effort could not hold into deep winter. Others believed the opposite and said little because belief did not move crates. The one shared premise was duty to prevent a break in routine that would be felt on kitchen tables. That premise set the cadence of the day. It also informed decisions that seemed invisible from the street: where to put a new storehouse, which side road to smooth, how to assign watches so that fatigue did not produce mistakes that rippled across the schedule. A visitor could walk through central districts and see only that life continued with restraint. The true map lay in timetables pinned to office walls and in chalk lines on hangar floors. From this order emerged a steadying thought. If the city could keep to the rhythm through the next set of weeks, negotiating rooms might feel a pressure that no statement could neutralize. Without saying as much, many behaved as if that thought were possible. As a cool wind began to suggest the season ahead, attention moved toward reinforcing surfaces, securing more reliable stores of fuel, and preparing for longer nights in which every hour of operation would matter to the shape of the morning. The quieter part of the contest played out in signals meant to unsettle without forcing a breach. Public notices from the opposing side continued to stress procedure and order, yet the placement of guards and the tone at crossings hinted at a desire to remind everyone that the city sat within a larger ring of control. There were periods when searchlights lingered at odd angles and when verbal instructions at the edge of air corridors sounded less neutral than before, though they stopped short of action that would trigger a wider incident. Inside Berlin, rumors moved quickly whenever the schedule shifted, which occasionally strained patience in queues and tested shopkeepers who were already stretched thin. City leaders answered with plain language and steady timing. They understood that morale could not be commanded, only preserved by sequences that held. A municipal meeting was held with heads of essential services, and its minutes, short and spare, captured requests for calm phrasing in public bulletins and for consistency in district notices. A second indicator appeared as a posted summary from the ration office, which listed district-level allotments for the next fortnight without comment or promise. Those words were chosen to be read and put away, not debated on street corners. The Western garrisons adjusted their posture to keep the temperature down. Patrols stayed inside routines that everyone recognized. Spokesmen kept remarks narrow and factual, letting repetition carry the message that the city would be supplied as planned. Behind doors, planners weighed the possibility that pressure might rise further if flights continued to meet targets. The best defense, they agreed, was perfect ordinary behavior. No sudden moves, no theatrical gestures, nothing that could be read as a dare. Even so, there were days when tempers frayed. Crews at the fields worked inside a fatigue that did not announce itself until it emerged as a small error, and supervisors learned to rotate tasks before that point. Residents dealt with the same strain in different ways. Some simplified meals to a pattern that could be maintained without disappointment. Some saved small comforts to mark the end of a hard week. These choices did not belong in reports, but they mattered. They kept the city from turning brittle. The air routes stayed busy even as the weather shifted and the light fell earlier. Operations officers watched cloud ceilings and made calculations that they did not share with the public. If a morning held, they would decide to push in the afternoon. If the first hours went poorly, they would seek a controlled recovery rather than chase a number that risked more slips. The goal was not display, it was continuity. Outside observers interpreted this discipline in different ways, which could be read in editorials that leaked into the city at times. Some argued that the effort demonstrated a long-term capacity to sustain the population. Others suggested it could falter in winter. Berlin had no use for these arguments. It needed heat, light, and food delivered at dull intervals. The opposing side continued to insist that compliance would restore normal circulation, a statement that both sides knew had been tested and found unstable. Even so, the language carried weight across negotiation tables. It allowed conversations to continue without resolution, while daily life carried the real content of the dispute. Witness notes from one exchange described the parties repeating familiar lines with varied emphasis, as if searching for a new shape inside old words. That is often how standoffs soften or harden, without anyone admitting which direction they have taken. The air plan, for its part, accumulated trust with every hour it avoided an incident. It did not explain itself. It simply arrived and left, again and again, with the quiet assurance of a schedule that had learned to protect itself. Berliners adjusted further. They kept small radios tuned to times when updates were likely. They accepted that a missed hour could be recovered later in the day. They also understood that a string of missed hours would mean tighter counters. The measured dignity of daily life held, aided by the simple act of keeping promises that could be checked. As ice formed in shallow puddles and breath showed at first light, the city shifted focus to preparations for deep cold, to safeguarding coal stocks, and to the hard problem of maintaining surfaces that would soon face frost before sunrise and thaw by afternoon. When winter settled over the city, the air felt metallic before dawn, and wood smoke lingered in stairwells long after evening. The plan met this season with respect rather than bravado. Ground crews rose earlier to check surfaces that had frozen overnight, then thawed just enough to hold water before mid-morning. Loading teams wrapped their hands in layers that allowed grip and speed. Drivers followed new routes that avoided patches known to break under weight. All of this created drag on the schedule, which required smaller adjustments to keep counts in reach. Pilots flew profiles that accepted lower ceilings when conditions allowed, then held in patient stacks when they did not. People in apartments learned to listen not only for arrivals, but for pauses between them. A long silence could prompt a rearranged day, a saving of fuel, a decision to queue earlier when the next delivery reached the district. Inside offices, planners set winter targets with humility and wrote contingencies in thin lines, not bold. They knew the city would forgive a shortfall caused by weather if communication stayed honest and the recovery was visible. Two reliable guides helped everyone track progress through the cold. A consolidated operations sheet combined both fields' movements and published a single figure each evening, readable without technical knowledge. A district circular issued by the utility board listed heating hours expected for the following week, adjusted as supplies allowed. These notices were not dramatic, but they let families plan their nights around certainty rather than rumor. Outside the city, pressure persisted. The other side kept its stance intact, letting administrative language carry the function of a barrier. There were days when the behavior around corridors felt sharper. Searchlights swung closer to approach paths. Voices at the edge of the routes selected words that suggested vigilance. Even so, the line held. The flights continued. On the ground, small gestures emerged that did not belong to strategy and were not tracked by any ledger. A child would point at the sound of an approach, and a passerby would nod without a word. Windows opened briefly to hear the change in tone when a plane crossed the field. None of this closed a checkpoint or moved a crate faster. It marked the human tempo that grew around the system. City workers adapted with the same quiet manner. They chose to smooth a corner of a road before dawn because it saved 5 minutes for the trucks that mattered most that day. They reserved a patch of warehouse for goods bound to a clinic so that a single delay would not spread. The solving of these small problems kept the fabric from tearing. Winter also brought strain that could not be fully managed. Ice took hold on mornings when the fog refused to lift. Crews rotated through rest that felt insufficient but necessary. There were incidents that called for quick decisions and then long hours of recovery. The habit of under-promising helped in these moments. People had been taught to expect a range, not a single number. They also knew what evidence to watch. If the consolidated figure appeared at dusk and the utility board delivered its notice on time, confidence endured. Negotiations outside the city continued to circle known phrases. The discussions were neither empty nor decisive. They offered space for the parties to measure costs without admitting it. Within this suspended state, Berlin lived one day at a time inside a structure that had been built from schedules, patience, and an insistence on public clarity. The crisis had become a system, and the system had become a habit. That habit did not mean safety. It meant the city could count on the next hour, arriving much like the last, provided everyone kept to their part. As the calendar moved past the coldest nights, people began to imagine a spring in which the pressure might ease. They did not predict outcomes aloud. They protected the good fortune of steady days by speaking simply about tasks to be done before nightfall. And so the effort pressed on, with planners watching for longer light, with field crews preparing for maintenance that had been deferred, and with negotiators sensing that the shape of talks might change when the thaw reached the edges of the corridors. The city held its posture through winter with patience shaped by need. The routine did not loosen the larger dispute. It only prevented the dispute from crushing daily life. Each day's counts were offered without flourish and accepted with the plain relief of work that meets its hour. The record of this period reads like a ledger and a weather diary combined. It shows flights that rose and fell with cloud and wind. It shows counters that tightened on difficult weeks and eased after a stretch of clear mornings. It hints at messages that passed in private and at positions that never changed in public. The narrative you have heard remains a reconstruction grounded in fragments that survive in accessible archives and in public summaries that were distributed at the time. Where those fragments leave space, reasoned inference has filled the gaps in a manner consistent with the behavior recorded by multiple sources. No final judgment is offered here. The winter did not decide the long contest. It merely revealed how a city could organize itself around a narrow set of reliable signals and endure a pressure designed to wear it down. What would the next season bring when fields dried and days lengthened? Would negotiations trace the same statements until fatigue suggested a compromise, or would a single decision reopen the ground with a new set of conditions? Could a routine built under strain be unwound without harm, and who would claim that change as a victory worth noting? The city listened for a different kind of morning, one in which cargo moved on wheels again and the air returned to normal noise, and it waited to see which hand would loosen first.